Happy Friday, everybody. We are excited to be back with you today talking poetry, specifically looking at a modern poem today after spending a couple of days looking at some older sonnets. Today, we're going to be talking about specific words and phrases in a text, and we're just looking forward to jumping on in with you. So I'm Susan Barber from Atlanta, Georgia, Grady High School. And my co-teacher is here with me, Bear. He'll be with us every day. He says hi. I also want to remind you that next week we'll have a calendar that comes out and it will give the daily schedule between now and May 1st. So you'll be able to just pick and choose the lessons that are going to best help you review for the exam. So with me again today is Mr. Escobar.
How are you guys? I'm very excited to be back with you all. And we have a few things to cover. We have a few things to talk about. First of all, I've heard of some conspiracy theories out there about how this year's exam will definitely be a poetry question because Ms. Barber and I have now spent 2 days talking poetry. But I will remind you all that we don't know, we don't have any insider information. But secondly, we talked about how we are going to focus on the last 2 units of this course, the final units 8 and 9. And unit 8 is all about poetry. And that's why we're focusing on poetry for these 3 days. And starting next week, we're going to focus on unit 9. So for those of you who think the theory is that it will be a poetry question, on Monday you can adjust that theory and think that it's an open-ended question. But all we have to do is wait till April 3rd, and then we're going to find out exactly what kind of exam we're going to be facing. So remember, no theories out there, no conspiracies. Right now, we're just going over Unit 8, then we're going to go over Unit 9, and then we're going to do a total review. But the good news is everything we're learning throughout Units 8 and 9 can be applied, or at least most of the things can be applied to any question that we are going to face on this year's exam. Again, I'm Mr. Escobar from Felix Varela Senior High School in Miami, Florida. And I also want to say that we have been very touched by many emails. And I'd like to say hi to everyone at Elkton High School. And we're very happy and pleased that you're able to find some comfort and some guidance in these videos. So thanks for tuning in, guys.
So let's go ahead and jump in with last night's practice, and that'll serve as our warm-up today. And we looked at the poem Convergence of the Twain, and we talked yesterday about contrast and how specifically you can identify contrast and how they connect to the meaning of the poem, how they add depth and expand on the meaning of the poem. So hopefully you had a chance to work on this. And I know that some of you have worked on this with your teachers and as a class, which I think is really great. And so just to highlight a few of the contrasts that we found in this poem, it's really interesting in almost every stanza. You can see these contrasts, these seemingly inconsistencies, and that makes us just wonder, why are they there and what are they saying? And so we think about this poem as a whole. You have this unsinkable ship that is sitting at the bottom of the sea. And so that's a contrast in itself. And then in each stanza, you see things like solitude, aloneness, but then humanity, a large thing, opulent, very grand and lavish, contrasted with grotesque and slimed. And there are so many of these contrasts, and you probably picked up on more than we found. And so we want to lean into these and think about, how do these add to the meaning of the work or your interpretation of the work? And so some possible claims that you might have come up with, they may look like this. The sparkles of the jewels lie lightless to convey the extent of the ship's demise. That hits both of these tensions that we're feeling, and it points us to the bigger meaning here. Another one, the mortal eye is contrasted with the imminent will, and the spinner of years to denote the futility of man's power over natural world. Again, those two examples are picking up on the tension here with the possible implication of man's futility over God's desire. So again, taking these very specific examples and letting that shed light and take us to a bigger, broader context and meaning. Now, there are lots and lots of claims that we could have suggested here. We want to just give you a couple, but what we want you to recognize is that there are lots more, and you probably found more examples. These are not the two right answers. They are just examples. And so we would encourage you to talk with your teachers, talk with other classmates about claims that you see. Did these work? How do these extend beyond the meaning of this stanza and onto broader implications in the text? So we really just invite you to look beyond the possibilities we have and think about different claims that you can find.
And today we're going to start looking at a different concept, one that you might be very comfortable with. We're going to be looking at the function of specific words and phrases. Remember, the first video we talked about structure, the second one we talked about contrast, and now we're going to get into the fine details of the words that these poets are using. Once again, the goal is not to generate a list of important words and phrases, but rather to get to that key word, and you're going to see that key word in each of our goals, the function of the words. What could those functions be? Well, they're going to help us recognize the important words, the important phrases, but then bring them together and see how they contribute to the central idea of the poem. So we're going to have to determine also what the central idea is to see how all these words and phrases work together to convey a message about that central idea. And we're also, specifically for this Unit 9, for this latter part of the course, we're going to talk about ambiguity. And sometimes we don't know exactly what the poet intends. And let me rephrase that. It's not that we don't know what the poet intends, but the poet is purposely being ambiguous, not because they don't want to share the truth, not because they have something to hide, but because that ambiguity adds to the richness. And I want you guys to keep that in mind. It's not about finding the right answer, like Ms. Barber said, right? That's not what we're after. What we're after is trying to find plausible interpretations, trying to, instead of close the poem, open it up and see all the possibilities that lie within it. For today, we're going to look at 3 levels, and I'll speak about levels today, 3 levels of words and phrases and key terminology that is connected to that idea. Level 1, and for those of you following and you understand what I mean about the standards and the units and the binders, that's more teacher talk than student talk, but I know that we have a lot of teachers watching these videos as well. These levels are really the appearances of these units in the binder, right? So the first time we look at words and phrases, we're talking about alliteration, antecedent, and repetition. How do these terms, how do these tools that poets use serve to convey ideas about a central notion in the text? Level 2, we're going to be looking at adjectives and adverbs and hyperbole and understatement. These are terms that you've probably already discussed with your teachers. These are terms that you've probably already reviewed and learned. And then when we look at the end of the course, under the umbrella term of words and phrases, that's when we look at ambiguity. So I want you to look at how the complexity of our understanding of words and phrases escalates as we move through the course. We're looking at alliteration. That's probably a term that you learned in middle school, right? We're looking at adjectives and adverbs. I know you learned that in elementary school, but we forget. And now we're not just finding them, but we're talking about how they function within the text. And that's where the complexity, I think, gets leveled up. And then obviously ambiguity, which is what today's lesson will focus on. To practice today, yesterday, Ms. Barber gave you a bit of a hint of what we're doing. What we decided to do, we reached out and we found an amazing local poet, contemporary poet, who was willing to share her poetry with us, because we, for the bulk of these sessions, we are going to turn to the texts that have already appeared on the AP exam. Obviously, those are texts that we're very familiar with, that teachers have used, that students might recognize, so then they'll be able to follow along. But we also want to find some great contemporary texts out there, but sometimes it's difficult to find the rights for those things. But we found a great poet who was very gracious and was willing to share a poem with us and allow us to share it with you. The poet is Miss Deborah Kwan, and her poem is Magic Lesson. So let's go ahead and read this poem. This is my face, a spinning plate. I'm unraveling as a mother does a knot from a bow to astonish you. In time, you'll master the fact that every woman has been sawed in half at least a dozen times before sunset.
Some of us walk through that wall. Some of us burrow beneath it. The rest spend their lives as bespoke assistants, younger siblings, bottom drawers unsticking, and then a lifetime ignites. For you, I'll wish for something else. I want you to be a student of impossible binds, a magician of a bloom from a fist, a dove from a dove from a dove. Love this poem so much and excited to dive into it with you today. So let's go ahead and start looking at some of the specific elements and devices that Mr. Escobar had talked about. Let's talk about the level 1 first, and these are like alliteration, antecedents, repetition, and we do see some of these things in here. Specifically, we can look at the end and we can see a dove from a dove from a dove. And I think that is so interesting. Anytime we see words that are repeated, we know like this is important. Now I've got to figure out, why is it this word that is being repeated? I think about a dove and maybe what a dove represents. And a dove represents is often a symbol for peace. And as this speaker is spinning, unraveling, trying to do all of these things, sawn in half at least a dozen times before some sunset, all of these different things, I love that we have this pulling of a dove, a dove, a dove at the end. Could it possibly mean that? That's something for us to think on as we read again and again. And you may, when you're thinking about repetition, you may form some ideas and think, I'm not sure exactly if this is what that means, but keep that tucked in your mind. And the more you read it, the more you may be able to lean into, yes, I think this is what it's saying. The more you read poetry, and this is tricky on the exam because you don't have a lot of time, but the more you read it, the clearer things are going to become. Before we move on, I'd like to talk just a minute about alliteration too. And there's a little bit of alliteration in this poem, but I think a lot of times students don't know exactly what to do with alliteration other than, the repetition of these consonants. We see that, but what does that mean? I think alliteration is just a way to really turn up the intensity quickly within a line, and that helps us focus on that line, and we know that's going to be an intense, very focused moment. So when you see alliteration, like some of us burrowed beneath it, and that B sound is kind of like a lower sound, and I think it emphasizes, it draws attention there about us burrowing and going beneath. So those are some examples of just some easy ways to start diving in and looking at specific parts of the poem and making meaning from it. Then we go to this next level that Mr. Escobar talked about, and we can look at adjectives and adverbs and hyperboles and understatements. And specifically in this, we're going to look at an adjective and we're going to think about the word spinning. It's interesting that this is one of the first images in the poem. And when we think about spinning, we just think about it's not ending. It goes on and on and on. And I think that's really interesting when we have this spinning image at the front, at the very beginning of the poem. Then at the end of the poem, we still have this, you know, it's going, we're pulling a dove from a dove from a dove. But instead of the spinning, maybe, is this how a symbol of peace fits in? I don't know. Interesting to think about, though, and that almost, like yesterday's lesson, sets up this contrast. And then finally, we move on to this level of ambiguity. And like I said, this is, or like Mr. Escobar said, this is one of the harder things because we can go a couple of different ways here. And when poets put in phrases that are ambiguous, it invites us as the reader to be open to more than one interpretation of it. And I love that because that helps us to really lean into there's not one right answer, but there are a couple of different ways it could go. So we look at this sentence highlighted. I'm unraveling as a mother does a knot from a bow to astonish you. Well, that is so, I mean, that can go a couple of different ways. You know, the mother's doing this routine task for a child. This is her work, you know. Is she unraveling from doing that? Is she unraveling because she's tired of astonishing others with all of her tricks? We can go some, and both are right. We can, it can take on either meaning, and that opens up this poem to not just be a very narrow poem, but it can speak to broader context and have different interpretations. That should, as a reader, give you confidence, knowing that you don't have to find the one specific meaning. And hopefully it will also give you some room in your interpretation as you're reading.
And this is one perfect example of how lesson 1 can tie into lesson 3. In our first lesson, we talked about structure. Here we have the movement. It's called enjambment for those of you who may have learned that term, the movement of one stanza or one line to another without stopping. Here we go from one stanza to the next without stopping. And that's so significant. That structural element is what creates the ambiguity itself. If we were to stop after it does, if it were to just say, I'm unraveling as a mother does, period, I think the implication there is that all mothers unravel at one time or another, and it's commentary on the state of motherhood or parenthood, whereas the flow invites a possible pivot to that interpretation. I'm unraveling as a mother does a knot, so it's the knots who unravel, not the mothers who do the unraveling, and maybe this time it's just me who's unraveling like this knot. So that structural element, that decision not to put a period there, that decision not to keep it within one stanza, really does impact how we read and thereby interpret this poem. So there's a little link between the first and the third lesson of this series. We keep talking about how we have to take these words and phrases and connect them to central ideas. But what are the central ideas? So one of the first steps we have to take now is figure out, well, what are some of the central ideas of this poem? What we've seen, though, and what we're really encouraged by, is that so many students and teachers are using these videos as tools to then extend their learning beyond the confines of our 30 to 45-minute session here. You know, we've heard from teachers who are using them as homework, as review, as extensions to their own teaching. So we decided to give you this little graphic organizer and populate it with this word so we can agree that motherhood is a central topic or a central idea. You may want to flesh this out into a full sentence, right? What is Kwan actually saying about motherhood in this poem? And then we're going to get more complex writing. But I don't know about Ms. Barber, but I'm tired of doing all the work over here. So the other boxes are left blank. And that's for you guys to think about, you know, what other notions, what other topics is Kwan wrestling with in this poem? The more ideas that you're able to come up with, then I think the deeper you'll be able to understand the poem, but also the more variety you might have for ultimately, what will my thesis look like? What's my ultimate claim going to be? But we're going to get to writing during some other lesson. Then we're going to see how much you're understanding. And these are the 3 sections of the poem that Ms. Barber pointed you to. We have spinning, which was the adjective. That was a level 2 words and phrases. We have repetition there at the end of the poem with a dove, 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 and we have the ambiguity of between stanzas 1 and 2. The point is not to find these within the poem, but the point is to determine how they connect to the central idea. So this is the second graphic organizer. This is the moment where you're going to take perhaps the idea of motherhood or some other idea that you come up with, and you're going to say, okay, this notion of a spinning plate, how does that convey something about what Kwan is saying about motherhood? You know, no one's looking for the perfect sentence at this point. We're looking for you to think about these things and jot down some ideas. And something you may want to do is, again, take a picture of this and then work on it after the video, because we're not going to populate it for you. We're not giving you the answers. We're setting you up so that you can be successful once you follow these processes that we're talking about. Then we'll do it again for the ambiguity, which is that second row, and the repetition. We listed them in the order that they appear in the poem. But the idea is that for each of these, you're going to create sentences or jot down notes that connect them to some central idea that you'd like to discuss. And Ms. Barber, I think something's happening here. We have a special message.
Oh, great. Who's it from?
I have no clue. Let's see.
Hi, hello, AP students. This is Debbie Kwan. I'm so excited to say hello to all of you and tell you how honored I am that Carlos chose my poem, Magic Lesson, to study with you guys in advance of your AP Lit exam. I just wanted to say that in my own life, poetry and literature have always been a refuge during especially difficult times, and we are certainly in especially difficult times right now. So I hope in your studies of literature and of poetry that you're able to derive just a little bit of solace, a little bit of peace, maybe a little bit of distraction too during this time. But I also wanted to let you know that we're all rooting for you and we're thinking about you. We're so pleased and proud of how committed you are to your AP work, and we wish you the best of luck in your exams. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right, so we're very excited. We'd like to thank Ms. Kwan for first of all, for letting us use her poem and extending that for us without any copyright issues, without any legal matters that we have to worry about. She was very gracious and very excited to be able to share that with the community out there. And then to send us that video, which was very exciting. And, you know, Shakespeare never sends us a video. So there's a point for Ms. Kwan right there. So again, Debbie Kwan, Ms. Deborah Kwan, thank you so much for sharing that with us and sharing your poetry with us. And we truly appreciate this gesture on your part. And why not? Let's send an invitation to any writer out there, any poet out there, you know, maybe Oprah Winfrey or Ellen are watching and they have friends. And if they'd like to share some of their books or poems with us and not charge me anything, then I'd appreciate that as well. But thank you again. Let's get back to it. Let's debrief, okay? We've talked about words and phrases and the importance of words and phrases. And we've talked about 3 levels of note-taking and thinking that we should engage in. The first level dealt with things like repetition, hyperbole and understatement. The second level dealt with adjectives, and then antecedent was also there in level 1, I apologize. And then the third level was ambiguity. Every poem out there, every text, this is one of those things that are cross genre, right? You're going to find issues with antecedents and prose. You're going to find significant adjectives and ambiguity, certainly in prose as well. So today's lesson is very significant, and I encourage all of you to go back and watch and follow the guided practice and do those graphic organizers, because they are key to changing the way we read, approach text, and ultimately the way that we write, and that is critical. But as always, we want to look at what are the key questions that we should walk away with after going through these steps and after going through this lesson. Some of the key questions here for the function of specific words and phrases are, what are the sounds or words that are repeated? Especially with poetry, where there is such an economy of words, for a poet to repeat himself or herself, then it has to be significant. And it's our job as careful readers to pick up on that repetition, whether it's repetition of sound or repetition of words and phrases, as we're talking about here, and connect that to a central idea and make some sort of claim about that. We looked at antecedent, and antecedent sometimes becomes really, really tough, right? In a text, when we find the word she or he or they, do we really know what the referent is? The referent is simply the noun that the antecedent, the pronoun, was replacing. And what are the relationships between the adjectives? A lot of times we talk about word choice, and this is when we're looking at the types of words. And here specifically, we're looking at adjectives and adverbs. These words called qualifiers. They qualify, they describe characteristic of a noun or a verb. Well, let's pick up on that, right? A lot of times we read something, we're like, something's going on. I feel like this person is really happy about something. Well, what words tell you that they're happy about something? And Ms. Barber, you want to talk about the last two?
Sure. So again, hyperbole, understatement, what seems exaggerated or what seems possibly overlooked? These are just invitations for you into the text. All of these actually are questions not that you'll memorize to take into an exam, but they're just ways that you train your mind to think about, how do I enter a poem? Ambiguity. If something is ambiguous, or it opens itself up to more than one meaning, that's a signal for our minds to think about the different directions that the text can go or the interpretation can go. And we want to lean into these invitations. So again, all of us as readers, and I think this is a really important point, all of us as readers enter poems at different points. Some of us will enter from the very beginning, others enter midway through. Some people may not even enter until the end, and then they can go back and make sense of it. So all of us have different entry points into poems. And so these questions are just to help us find what is our point of entry. And now that we've entered, how can we begin to make understanding of what's being said? So tonight, or this weekend, or whenever, we want to give you a little bit of practice. And again, we're going to look at another more modern poem. This was from the 2006 exam. And we're going to ask you to look at this poem, To Paint a Water Lily. And we're just going to be practicing the same things that we looked at today. Look for significant words or phrases. So are things being repeated? Do we have alliteration? Could there possibly be antecedents, ambiguity? What are some things that you see in here that are a signal that, oh, I need to look at this a little more closely. And then once we've identified those specific words or phrases, we want you to connect them to a central idea or central ideas, more than one idea. How can you take these very specific words and phrases, and how do they expand and add to the meaning of the poem, your interpretation of the poem? And that's what we'd like you to practice with. Hopefully you got some good tips and strategies today, and this will be a good practice for you. And we will open with this on Monday. So again, it is Friday. Thank you for being with us this first week. And we really appreciate all of the emails we've gotten. We're hoping that these videos are a resource for you and your teachers, and that you'll be able to figure out how to best use them to just supplement the things that you've already been learning in the classroom. We do want to remind you that if you know of people who don't have access to technology and need that, there's this slide that I think is coming up, and you can reach out to this website, this email, and College Board definitely wants everyone to have the tools they need to be able to take the test.
You know, Ms. Barber, I would like to maybe take the opportunity here with this poem to remind our students that if you have watched the previous two videos, go ahead and add annotations regarding structure and contrast here, right? I just received a text from one of my students and said, it's couplets, right? So clearly students out there are starting to look at structure, and that's encouraging. I think that if you watch all these videos in whatever order you watch them, as I think I've said before, the idea is to add to your body of knowledge and not compartmentalize your body of knowledge. So if you watch the others and you have something to say about structure, and you have something to say about some of the contrasts that appear in this poem, absolutely add that to your annotations and make the connections to the central ideas that you're talking about, because that's how you're going to build a rich and possibly sophisticated essay, right? Which I'm starting to drop some of the words that we're going to be talking about later on. So absolutely, whatever you've learned and whatever you can bring into the reading of this poem will absolutely enhance your understanding and appreciation of it ultimately. As
that's a great point. None of these things are in isolation, and they all fit together. And hopefully what you're seeing is you just have a lot of tools that you can rely on to go to with all of these. So that is a great point. And when you see these practice questions and examples, apply prior knowledge, because that just gives you more and more practice, and you'll see that hopefully you're already seeing that you're able to read poems more richly than you were before.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you Monday. Here's an extra homework assignment. How about you read a book? Right? There's a lot of stuff in the public domain. I'll throw out a recommendation. How about you read, since we're going to be looking at Unit 9, we're going to be looking at longer fiction and drama next week. How about you pick up Earnest, The Importance of Being Earnest? You can find that, I think, a PDF through maybe your textbook, or maybe through Project Gutenberg, I think, has some as well. So let's read Earnest, everybody, and then we'll see how we make connections next week on longer fiction. Take care, everyone.
Happy Friday.